At Fide.email, we believe in protecting your privacy and supporting your faith. Fide.email offers peace of mind with features like end-to-end encryption and secure communications tools. Your data stays private and your values remain intact. Choose an email provider that understands what matters to you. Make the switch to Fide.email today.
The secular news involving the Catholic Church is unfortunately continuing and doesn't look like it's going to be letting up anytime soon, which I did sort of warn about here in the last few days. And until this issue is resolved, which I don't think it's going to be for the next potentially 12 years, we are probably going to see the bishops of the United States butting heads with the current and then probably the next administration. That's just how it's going to be. So brace yourselves for the continued and never-ending and probably increasingly vitriolic response from the U.S. bishops. And I saw some people online saying, guys, American Catholics, please, the U.S. bishops are oftentimes better than most bishops in other places. Please don't turn against them. That's true. They are better on some moral issues than a lot of the bishops of other places. But it's amazing how quickly they folded and gave the church away, essentially for money. That's what they did. But before we get to that story, because as I think it may have been Dr. Peter Kwasniewski said this on X yesterday, if the FSSP, if the biggest, the best and brightest priests from the FSSP and the Institute of Christ the King were made auxiliary bishops and then made bishops not terribly long thereafter in the United States, you could turn the whole church in America would be turned around in a decade. And I don't think he's wrong about that. But the FSSP have put out a public request for a novena prayer. They want your help, not financially. They are the subject of apostolic visitations again, which means delegates from Rome are inspecting their seminaries, their major governing houses, and some of their parishes, and seeing if the FSSP are up to no good in the eyes of Rome. The FSSP always put a positive spin on these announcements, but we've seen how apostolic visitations are used against good priests. So please consider joining the FSSP in prayer for this. So for the brief aside, go to the announcement from LifeSite. The headline: FSSP announces novena consecration to Our Lady during Vatican visitation. A visitation, when it starts involving priestly fraternities or religious or anything, it's never good news. It never, ever, ever is good news and should be taken as not necessarily that they're going to be shut down or anything. A lot of people predict that will happen eventually, but it does look like they're looking for any excuse to punish them. Traditional priestly fraternities must be kept in line because the traditional mass, the traditional devotional life of the church, the traditional kinds of things preached at in homilies in the before Vatican II, we have been told by the authorities in Rome, are not compatible with synodality, not compatible with the church after Vatican II. Begs a lot of questions, and I've gone over that before. But here's the actual announcement from the FSSP themselves. They have announced a consecration of the FSSP to Our Lady, as well as a novena that will be on the 11th of February. Here is the article, quote, 3 years ago, at a moment of deep incertitude, the priestly fraternity of St. Peter called out to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, mindful that never was it known that anyone who fled to her protection has been left unaided. Following a novena, the fraternity consecrated herself to her Immaculate Heart on the very day that the Holy Father providentially published the decree reaffirming the practice and charism of the fraternity that the fraternity has had from its foundation. 3 years later, in order to render thanks once again and implore her continual help, all the members of the fraternity will solemnly renew this consecration. To represent them, the members of the plenary council and I, Reverend John Berg, will recite the act of consecration at the Grotto of Lourdes on her feast day, February 11th. We ask all the faithful who are close to us to join in this novena of preparation, February 2nd to the 10th, 2025, and to renew the consecration on the feast of Our Lady of Lourdes, February 11th, 2025. They made this announcement about 10 days ago. Been meaning to get to this. I'll have links to this at the show notes at returntotradition.org for those of you who want to join in prayer to support the Fraternal Society of St. Peter. When they're invoking the protection of Our Lady and apostolic visitation in the same sentence, you can read a little bit between the lines if you are so inclined to do so. With that, let's get to the main story of the day. President Trump's press secretary had her first press meeting yesterday, and this came when, on the heels of people noticing that an executive order had been signed, taking essentially federal funding away from non-governmental organizations. And the media tried to spin this to say that he had frozen funding for Medicare and food stamps and student loans, which was not true. Not surprised the media would be dishonest about this, but he did cut off funding to non-governmental organizations, meaning nonprofit organizations, which cover a whole host of things. Let's say there's a beach cleanup organization. All they do is organize volunteers to pick up trash off beaches. Maybe they get a little federal funding. They got their funding frozen, as did the groups we'll talk about today. Now, as for the new press secretary, conservatives are lauding her for being a rather massive upgrade compared to her predecessors who worked under Joe Biden, which wouldn't be hard to be honest because they were awful. But a detail from that press conference yesterday started making the rounds on X. So we're going to go to complicit clergy for this headline. Breaking. President Trump has reportedly cut off federal funding to Catholic charities. To put it mildly, folks, that's kind of a big deal. That is not something that you take lightly. And you will find a lot of Catholics are going to be very upset at this because they believe that what the Catholic Charities does is good work. Now, Miss Levitt was asked by a reporter about Vice President Vance's words to the U.S. bishops and about how Catholic Charities receiving funding for helping what we have to call around here the unannounced visitors to evade the law and get settled and, to borrow a term from Francis, our common home. Her response is pretty straightforward. Using a presidential executive order, the president cut off funding for Catholic Charities. Now, she said this, but it was in the context of all the NGOs. The reason that was, at least for Catholic Charities, is this. Catholic Charities, it has, as we've gone over repeatedly in the last few days, from 2021 through 2024, they've received $2.9 billion with a B through various federal funding programs on the issue that's dominating the news these days. And if you go back all the way to 2009, they received $5.2 billion with a B. The numbers are out there in their taxes and other things, and they get this through a whole variety of mechanisms. Now, the U.S. bishops have responded to this, claiming they don't make any money on it at all, that it costs them money, yada, yada, yada. I don't believe them. I believe the bishops saying that are telling you the truth in as much as they believe the words coming out of their mouth. But I don't believe that is necessarily true. She said, Miss Levitt said this happened via executive order, and she'd be happy to get the information about that executive order to the reporter in question, and I found a good outline of that for you. Now, the reason this came up, again, if you're not on X, I go back and forth with this. The Catholic community on X is a hot mess. It just is. And X can be a really Wild West kind of place these days. But if you're not there, you might want to consider being there for a number of reasons. And you'll see a lot of the news that ends up getting talked about before anybody in the media is talking about it. So I'm going to show you a woman named Juanita Broderick. For those of you who are my age or older, you might remember Miss Broderick. She became famous in the 1990s because she was one of the women that accused Bill Clinton of trying to, shall we say, forcibly have dates with her. Okay, if you catch my meaning with that. That's how she became kind of famous. She's not exactly unbiased in this. She has, associated with the political right. But she posted a video that's making the rounds on X and Facebook from a high-ranking official at a local Catholic Charities office telling the uninvited guests how to evade law enforcement. In other words, that's Catholic Charities using your taxes assisting people in breaking the law. That is, of course, a giant no-no, especially when you have a law and order person in the White House directing law enforcement action. She is literally trying to undermine the work going on right now. Now, you might say, well, she's a Catholic. This is unjust. The church in the current catechism would disagree. The church going all the way back to St. Thomas Aquinas would disagree. The church has said, yes, you have the ability, you have the responsibility, governments do, individual people living in places do, to welcome those uninvited guests as best to the ability as you can. And it reiterates that Caesar has the right to set the rules for entry. that Caesar has the right to determine who can and cannot come in, and has the right to remove people who violate those rules, and that one of the responsibilities of those who come in need to be to follow the rules, including on how the rules on coming in the first place. And this is Catholic Charities helping to violate Catholic social teaching on this. Now, this video is a bit much for YouTube, unfortunately, but here's the general gist of it. No, the Catholic Charities employee is not telling people how to evade law enforcement in a way that would result in, say, anybody who took their advice being chased by an officer on foot or anything. It's actually quite the opposite. She's telling her intended audience how to deal with law enforcement in a way that will help gum up the works of law enforcement. This is essentially lawfare being waged against the people of this country and against the current administration in violation of the common good and in violation of Catholic social teaching. The phrase "render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar" applies on this topic, that Caesar has the right to make rules about these things completely according to the church, and this is Catholic Charities violating that without question. And this woman who's speaking here, she's not the woman on the screen. She's using both your tithing dollars to do this as well as your tax dollars. Something to remember here. Catholic Charities is often the recipient of second special collections at Mass in your parish. In years past, before new media made all of this well known to the public, you may have given to that second collection to Catholic Charities. Why wouldn't you, after all? Catholic Charities, they tell you, helps, poor families and things and does all this great work. That's what we were always told. Now, in the last 24 hours since this story broke, I had numerous people tell me on X and on Facebook and elsewhere that in their past, they or their loved one tried getting help from Catholic Charities and were always turned down without question, even though when they described their circumstance, they should have at least gotten a good hearing. But they never did. They were always turned away really quickly into it because that's not what Catholic Charities does. They're not involved in the work of charity. They're involved in the work of subverting the common good. And unfortunately, they do this with the full-throated help of the U.S. bishops and, of course, Uncle Sam. Now, that video making the rounds got a lot of attention. And, Juanita Broderick sharing it again. Some people don't take her seriously as a source, even though it's literally a video from Catholic Charities, because she tends to be biased. If you know anything about her history, like I just talked about, you understand why she's biased. But here we go to somebody else. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene. This got the attention of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is not exactly the least colorful member of Congress on the conservative side of things. But she's influential in Congress, and she has promised to have the people behind this video get called before her committee. And she said this on...
I really enjoyed seeing that video again today. I've watched it several times, and so has our Doge committee staff, because I'll be the first to tell Real America's Voice and your viewers, that woman and Catholic Charities will be coming before my subcommittee. We're not going to tolerate NGOs that take the American people's hard-earned taxpayer dollars and use it to enable and facilitate the invasion of America. And that is what Catholic Charities has been doing for a very long time. We're Christians too. We support all good things and helping people, but we will not allow our money to go towards those causes. So I look forward to meeting that woman, whatever her name is, but we're working on trying to find out. I really enjoyed seeing that video again today.
Catholic Charities is now going to be called before Congress. And the reason they explicitly are going to get called before Congress is because Catholic Charities is one of the highest profile of these kinds of organizations in the country. They work for the U.S. bishops. Catholics are like the largest denomination. We're not a denomination, but we get classified as a denomination. We're the largest denomination in the country. And as a consequence for that, all of our charitable organizations tend to get some scrutiny. But it wasn't only Catholic Charities that got defunded via executive order. It was virtually all NGOs that got their funding pulled or at least frozen. NGOs are the biggest offender in using tax money to subvert the common good of the United States. And here's a good thread explaining how this works. Again, one of the reasons I think X has become so valuable is it puts in bite-sized pieces information on how this stuff works. And you can vet this, which I did. This is all accurate. Here's what this person said. They said, this is arguably the single most important aspect of Trump's funding freeze. The movement crisis isn't an accident. It's a well-oiled system facilitated by powerful NGOs and funded by your tax dollars. By defunding the NGOs, he is crippling the entire system. And here's from Reuters 4 days ago. U.S. group on the movement, funding suspended under his aid pause. Here's what happened. The president signed an executive order suspending and allowing unwelcome visitors into the U.S. And the State Department went a step further. They issued a stop work order to their NGO partners, suspending all funding for the finding places for unwelcome visitors to be. Now, the State Department's headed by the Secretary of State, who is now Marco Rubio, a Catholic. Just so people understand this, this word here, which, as soon as I use that on YouTube, I get unwanted attention. But that word there, that, refugi, say it properly, and that's what it is. You'll know what I mean. Those folks, there are laws about admitting people claiming that. And it is the most misused part of law, international law out there. It is estimated that 90% of people who claim that status are lying, that they're breaking the law. And now they're looking for ways to actually enforce the law so that people who legitimately need to escape bad things will actually get the help they need. Virtually no one is disputing that people who legitimately need help escaping bad situations should have the help, that we should help them. No one is arguing against that. It's that 90% of the people making the claim are lying. And NGOs are just so happy to help them facilitate their deception. In response to their funding freeze, the NGOs were beside themselves, and for good reason. Very few of these groups are self-sufficient. Most of them are sustained by federal tax dollar gravy train. The current situation is being financed by your government with your money, hence their outraged statements. And then there's all these just headlines. One number I saw was that somebody who was on the opposite side of the issue from where you can tell I am was on X saying, I've just got out of a group call with a couple hundred senior executives for these kinds of NGOs. They're putting emergency 30, 60, 90-day plans in place to try to keep operations going. Most of them won't make it to 30 days. You can expect that by March 1st, some of these NGOs will either go out of business or do massive layoffs and freeze operations to try to wait things out, because they rely almost 100% on federal funds. Catholic Charities is not one of those. Catholic Charities gets a lot of its money from the second collections. And there's also another source of money that almost nobody mentions, and that is what we would call dark money. These are from wealthy individuals, ideologically driven, and they use specific policies like what we're talking about here to achieve some of their very questionable, if not outright evil ends. Because we are talking about here is the exploitation of desperately poor people from pretty nefarious reasons. This is why I'm flabbergasted that Catholic Charities just leans into this, because they're aiding the people who are essentially really poor being exploited for really nefarious reasons. He continues saying, to be clear, these NGOs exist to subvert the law on the subject at every step of the process, including actively bringing people in, fighting enforcement efforts at the boundaries, finding places for them to live, and lobbying for the policies that govern all of that to change. And again, they've been doing it on your dime. For the past 4 years, the Biden State Department has been mainlining taxpayer funds to groups that run an end-to-end network for doing all of this work, beginning deep in South America and finishing with bringing people into specific American communities. Again, people have wondered how this was happening, because clearly this was organized. Well, it's the NGOs, including Catholic Charities, doing this. They invoke the word humanitarian to describe what they're doing, to bring them up. They provide waypoints with shelter and medical services, maps in Spanish showing the best route to the U.S., and legal services for them to help beat the system once they're here. Again, this is the NGOs. And they give them cash, pay cards. Here are the list of the top 10 worst offenders. Church World Service, the Episcopal ministries were related to Movement of People, Ethiopian Community Development Council, the Global Elder Brother nonprofit, International Rescue Mission. The Lutherans have their own version of this, the U.S. Committee for those folks in question, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, as well as Bethany Christian Services and World Relief. They're your 10 biggest ones. Most of these groups are only able to operate because of the federal government. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is not one of them. Take the USCCB. He's focusing here on the U.S. bishops. In 2023, they received 129 million in federal grants for these services. They spent 130.5 on it, meaning this is again the bishop saying, "Well, we don't make any money." Yeah, they spent about $1 million extra than they made from the federal government. There are other ways to get money for this. That dark money that I mentioned, as well as working for other NGOs, smaller groups who get a federal contract but can't do it themselves, well, then they partner with the USCCB. Their activities on this are almost 100% taxpayer funded. Remember, the US bishops also use your tithes to do this. Then he goes on to talk about the Lutheran group and other groups on this. You just see this over and over again. He say, if you're looking for the villain at the center of the current problem, it's these guys. The NGOs for this subject are a fifth column in American politics, and they've essentially been acting as an extension of the federal government. But not anymore. This is a big, big win. Just understand, that's how it works. This is why you see the bishops all upset about this, because they believe, many of the bishops believe that this is what they're supposed to be doing. Now, Cardinal Robert Sarah recently came out, and he's for like a decade actually been speaking on this issue, mostly in the context of Europe, because this problem in Europe is literally causing, like, there's a whole other element to what's going on in Europe, right? The followers of the crescent moon religion and their false prophet, they're bringing down what's left of Christendom there. That's what's happening. And Cardinal Sarah said, anybody who uses the Bible to justify what these groups are doing is bewitched. That's the word he used, that they're serving the devil. Because the devil can use scripture to his own ends as well. One of the most famous warnings in scripture. But that's why the bishops have been issuing response after response in the form of foaming at the mouth of denunciations of what's going on. They stand to lose billions over the next few years, going so far as to claim that the cost of subverting the common good of America costs more money than they bring in. There are other perks to them doing this work, right? And I actually doubt their own numbers on this, even if I admit that that many, if not most, of the bishops whining about this publicly actually believe the things they're saying. There's a lot of money for NGOs out there to support them, including, again, that dark money from wealthy, ideologically driven private parties to help make all this happen. That money guarantees that the work of these NGOs is profitable, but their response is not surprising. In fact, their response is multi-tiered, because there's a lot of virtue signaling going on here, virtue signaling to the aligned laity who agree with them, but also virtue signaling to other interested parties on other issues. I'm going to give you an example of this virtue signaling. Cardinal Wilton Gregory is the outgoing Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. His replacement's already been announced, Cardinal Robert McElroy from San Diego, and he is one of the sharper minds among the Bergoglian modernists, and he's been tasked with keeping the new president in check on the movement of people, as well as a whole host of other things. But he hasn't even taken the see of Washington, D.C. yet. He doesn't actually take office in D.C. until March. Cardinal Gregory is still in charge, and he responded to the changing political atmosphere in the United States by having the church apologize for its Catholic values and for its past and history of teaching the Catholic faith on unpopular moral issues. He is rejecting the church's authority in defending basic moral truths. That is what Cardinal Gregory is doing here. It's unfortunate, but it's not all that surprising. So we go to the best website possible for this, one of these groups who do this work. And by the way, if you're wondering about the broader topic going on right now, the movement of people, the U.S. bishops responding to this, which will have never-ending coverage probably for the next few years, simply because of what it is, how the U.S. bishops are going to keep responding and everything that's at stake for them. That issue and the James Martin sin issue are deeply connected, because it is the same crowd who is subverting the teachings of the church, either actively or passively, because there's both ways they're doing it, who are also advocating for the annihilation of the common good through twisting the scriptures for the purpose of making money from these nonprofit organizations. We go to Outreach Catholic, which is an organization run by James Martin. The headline: Cardinal Wilton Gregory, I apologize to the James Martin crowd, self-described Catholics. He gave this as a homily. This is remarkable, and I think beyond the pale, even for somebody like him. And I saw this story because Eric Sammons posted it on X, and he said this perfectly. He perfectly summed it up. He said, "These performative apologies serve only to undermine the teaching and authority of the church in order to be accepted by fashionable elites. It does nothing to rescue souls from condemnation. Cardinal Gregory is sadly preaching the anti-gospel." An anti-gospel is an interesting turn of phrase. If you've been watching my channel for a long time, you know that I like to pretty regularly cover Catholic prophecy. One of the elements of Catholic prophecy from La Salette, Our Lady of the Good Event of the Purification, more commonly called in English Our Lady of Good Success for some reason, but it's Our Lady of the Good Event of the Purification when you transliterate the name, as well as other Catholic Marian apparitions and mystics. Throughout history, all kind of said the same thing, that part of the chastisement would be that the church would for a time be run by people more in love with money than the gospel, that they'd be more interested in the claim of the world than the gospel, and that would essentially be the spiritual side of the chastisement, which I think we're living through now, and have been for some time. God willing, that means it's almost over. We shall see. But here is the sum total of what Cardinal Gregory said on this issue. This is all tied together. So, from the article, quote, this is him in his own words, by the way. "Our faith is a gift that no Catholic ever truly merits or is ever fully capable of constraining. Each one of you might well look deep into your own heart, and there you will probably recall many of the people and the personal circumstances that lead you to your Catholic faith. And you will note that I use the present form of the verb, lead, since all of us must continue on the journey of faith until we reach the kingdom that the Father has prepared for us. We come to faith through the good example of parents, grandparents, teachers, spouses, children, neighbors, priests, and sisters who by their own witness inspire us to believe as they believe, to pray as they pray, to serve the needs of others as they do. As an aside, remember, if you want to sell people on error, if you want to make them believe in error, the best and easiest way to do it is to wrap it in the truth. And nothing he has said so far here is wrong, and much of what he says here is actually correct. But that's how you sell people an error, by wrapping it in the truth. Much like you would if you have a pet dog who needs medicine that he does not want to take. So you take the little capsule from the vet and put it in some of his dog food, and then you give it to him. That's the same way. It's the same kind of principle. Even for people who are baptized as infants, the witness of others encourages them to appreciate and embrace the faith that the sacrament has already planted in their heart. We know this to be the case since infants who have received the sacrament of baptism, but whose own circumstances deny them the witness of devoted parents and family, can and often do fail to realize and to bring to fulfillment the gift of faith that the sacrament has already planted within them. Faith, I believe, is born in all of our lives through the good example of the people that God sends our way. The Jubilee year of 2025 focuses our attention on hope. I've never regretted one moment of being a member of this Catholic community of faith, meaning the Church, even though these past 66 years have included many moments of question and even uncertainty. Faith is never a journey without its bumps and detours. If a person says that they have never questioned their faith, I doubt that they have ever reflected seriously upon the gift of faith that they claim. What couple has never entertained a reservation about the wisdom, prudence, or cause of their union? One of the common questions that youngsters ask me is whether I have ever had any doubts about my faith. Even at an early age, those young people have already begun to experience that faith does not exist without challenges and many moments of doubt. I certainly acknowledge that I've had many. The gift of faith is never free from moments of hesitation, pain, and frequent serious questions. You recall the controversy that surrounded the publication of Mother Teresa's autobiography, in which she openly revealed the struggles that she endured and the dry moments that plagued her throughout her own extraordinary life of holiness. It seems that true believers, deeply holy people, and even saints often endure profound periods of doubt, fears, and questions regarding the gift that they find so precious and compelling. Here's what he's going and saying all this true stuff to set up for this. This is where it gets nefarious. I could smell the sulfur. I smelled the sulfur when I first read this. Even those who inspire and glorify the heritage of the Church by their heroic virtue and extraordinary lives of holiness spend long periods of doubt and anxiety. So my faith has never been shaken because of the many doubts and questions that I've entertained. I have and I continue to feel sorrow and embarrassment, however, that it has come to my faith because of the negative images that all formal religion has had to endure increasingly during the past generation. I felt the sorrow of scandals that have touched and seriously damaged our Catholic Church, and the humiliation that has visited my life because of the disgrace that religious intolerance and bigotry visits in all Christian churches. He's blaming the Church here. I have been ashamed because of the flawed example that we Catholics have given to the world, because of our increasingly harsh treatment of one another, rejecting people because of race, realities of the flesh and their inclinations, ethnic origins, and other distinctions. Catholics on both sides of the ideological spectrum have heaped vicious and cruel condemnations upon all others who do not view the church as they themselves have decided to be the only valid vision of the body of Christ. You hear what he's saying here? He says that we have decided as believers, erroneously is the implication, that this is the only, that the Catholic Church is the only valid vision of the body of Christ, and by doing so, that's evil. Such horrible infighting among various people calling themselves Christian has caused many others outside the Catholic Church, as well as many within, to throw up their hands and turn their backs on the possibility of ever wanting to become or remain a member of such a dysfunctional family. And while the ideologues may believe themselves at opposite points of the ecclesial spectrum, they are joined at the hip in the damage they have inflicted upon this church that Christ himself founded. We bishops and clerics have played more than our share in bringing shame to the precious institution of Christ by our sinful weaknesses and lack of courageous and effective leadership in response to the sins of the clerics. Well, that much is true. These times seem so unlike that experience of the church that I discovered as a child in Chicago's Southside Parish School that witnessed a love for the truth of the church that both fascinated and beckoned me to their baptismal font. As I grew to know more about this church of ours, I discovered that every age has produced its conflicts, its disagreements, its controversies, its theological differences. Occasionally, those differences led to the witness that only martyrs can provide. So serious have they been. And he goes on to talk about, divisions among, in the ecumenical sense, because he's a good synodalist. He's a good leader in the church of the new synodal church, which is ecumenical in nature and super inclusive and all the rest of it. He even talks about how he's been troubled by the loss of Catholics and people who don't necessarily believe things, framing it, though, in anemic worship. That's a dig at traditionalists, who they always call the traditional mass anemic and sterile. They, and calling out people because we don't agree with the ideology of the flesh that is now being just roundly rejected in the culture. Thanks be to God for that. Then he goes here. Says, I've heard too often of former Catholics who have abandoned their faith for other religions because they have felt comfortable and better served therein. Leaving Christ for other non-Christian religions because they have discovered a depth of prayer, therein is a sorrow that tears at my soul. How have I failed to witness to Christ effectively so my sisters and brothers are strengthened in their faith rather than driven from it? Interfaith exchange has grown more important, excuse me, as people from many of the world's great religious traditions are now our neighbors. There's no room for religious meanness that is largely fueled by lack of knowledge and ignorance. And he goes on. Here's the meat of this. I have never for one moment doubted that I have made the correct journey of faith within Catholicism, but I have been deeply distressed by the state of things in the world in which the church must witness to the risen Lord. I apologize for my own failure to emulate Christ's compassion. The way we have treated our James Martin type brothers and sisters has brought them tears and too many of us disgrace. I apologize from the heart for the hurt that has resulted in the loss of so many of our family members who belong to God no less than I do. I apologize not only for those whose past actions have scandalized and wounded these men and women. I apologize for my own lack of courage to bring healing and hope, and I ask forgiveness. In other words, he apologizes for upholding the Catholic faith, teaching the hard truth. Yes, there are charitable, delicate ways of saying the true thing, that if you live a certain way and you do not repent of it, you're doomed, essentially. There are ways of communicating these things, but that's not what he's getting at. What he is getting at is that the church is wrong, that it's ideologically driven and sterile worship and all the rest of this stuff to uphold the teachings of the faith. In keeping with the greater debate going on with the enforcement of law at the federal level right now, you can see how these things are tied together. It's one seamless garment. Their diabolical seamless garment theology, crafted by Cardinal Bernardin with the help of some of the Jesuits in the 1960s, foisted on the people of the church and pushed as the de facto way of looking at complex moral issues. That is what they do. That's all they do. Philip says, despite issues with these charities, let's not have a hard heart and forget that there are many traditional charities that do need our help. I love mission traditions. Yeah, no, there are plenty of good charities out there. It's just it's incumbent upon you as an individual believer. If you don't want to give to your diocese or your parish, but you want to give to charities, to at least vet them a little bit to see what kind of work they're doing and then give appropriately. A generally safe one is a seminarian fund for traditional priests. I wish I knew the name of it, but there's a fund out there for young women who are wanting to enter religious life to help pay off their student loans, that their entire entry into religious life is predicated on them not coming in with, $50,000 in student debt. Those are laudable things, as well as, of course, Catholic charitable organizations that do the corporal works of mercy. We are required to support those things in some way or another. We should be able to trust giving money to our parish to facilitate it. But unfortunately, as the debate in the last couple of weeks have shown, that's not always the case. But yes, that's Cardinal Gregory apologizing for the church's hard moral teachings and his own part in upholding them, which I can't imagine what that would be. He's earned some rather nasty nicknames for decades of subverting the church's teaching on these things. So any final thoughts on all this in the live chat? Please get it in. And let me know what you think about this in the comments. This is, one of those issues that is not going to go away. Cardinal Gregory is retiring. The greater debate's going to intensify with Cardinal McElroy there going in, who has, remember, in the last 2 years, he wrote several pieces for the National Catholic Reporter and American Magazine, essentially reaffirming everything Cardinal Gregory said there, as well as taking on the new president for all of his stances on things, trying to pit the church against Caesar in this, which if Caesar was in the wrong, that would make sense. But this human element in the church, these modernist heretics who have official offices, they're actually the ones in the wrong on this stuff, and they violate church teaching left and right, as is the case with this Cardinal Gregory story. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in. And as always, please pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.